Welcome, infants, well-arrived children, and take a seat, kids. Today we have the second part of our trilogy of changes coming in Midnight, after the first one being the purging, the removing of most of the combat add-ons, leaving us to have a much less customizable and info-full UI compared to now. Now we have the second part, which is the pruning that is also happening not just to your UI, but also to your bars. Because the pruning is also going to touch the specs. Your specs, our specs. This pruning has proved quite extensive. Specs like Demo, Warlock lost their Demonic Strength button, they lost their Summon Vile Film button, they lost all of their Doom interaction, they lost their Felguard button, they also have a significantly lessened and weakened Implosion with a lower Wild Imp cap to play. You have specs being completely butchered, like Resto Shaman. Resto Shaman lost Cloudburst Totem, lost Unleash Life, lost Earthenwall Totem and Ancestral Protection Totem, they lost Wellspring, they lost their iconic old school Tidal Waves passive, as well as pretty much their Healing Tide Totem, since now it is a choice node with Ascendance, and you will always take Ascendance. Or specs that lost slightly less, but they lost a lot of their interactions they had to play around with. For example, Arcane Mage. Arcane Mage lost Nether Precision, they lost Late Drinker, and they lost Intuition, and they lost Arcane Harmony. So technically it's not buttons that are being lost, but it is a series of buffs and stacks to keep track and variables for you to choose when to use certain abilities, rather than the actual buttons being lost. Some specs, if you can believe it, have been made even simpler than they were before, like Devastation Evoker, which was already known as one of the more simple specs to play. Flameshaper used, once upon a time, to have Firestorm as a spell. Now Firestorm has turned into a passive effect. It's gonna happen by itself. Devastation also used to have Shattering Star as a spell. Now Shattering Star is a passive, automatically cast by Eternity Surge. So as Devastation Evoker now, you pretty much just have Living Flame for a single target or Azure Strike for AoE. You spend your Essence with Pyre in AoE or Disintegrate in single target, and you use your Empower spells, Eternity Surge or Fire Breath. That's it. You lost two of your other buttons now. So players are making lists, are keeping stock of all of the things they have lost from this pruning. Blizzard has come up, of course, with their whole manifesto of what they mean by these changes. Their major bullet points are explaining how combat complexity is going to affect players and how to make this complexity more approachable in Midnight, and highlighting the biggest problems of this complexity, meaning abilities that need add-ons to work, abilities without any meaningful gameplay function, as well as the multiple modifier auras, the multiple buffs that need to be stacked before you can make the best use of a certain ability. One of their major points when explaining how to make WoW more approachable, as they explain, the core point of this idea, as they say, is we want to ensure that players have all the necessary information to play a spec with clearly visible prompts and indicators, which can mean changing the design of complex abilities or reducing the number of buffs or debuffs that can be active, so it's easier to essentially track the information on your UI. As Blizzard says, they explain the problem of having cognitive load to parse the information of what's happening in your screen for your character. Tasks such as keeping track of active auras, parsing conditions to choose the most effective ability, remembering long sequences, longer like ramp series of buttons you have to press in order. And that's one of the things they want to skim down. They go on to their examples. First is to use abilities without needing add-ons, which is what we have been seeing obviously coming to play in our last video about the removal of add-ons, since obviously you remove the interaction of WeakAuras that can make sometimes way simpler the usage of certain buttons. For example, Arcane Mages had so many multipliers and buffs to keep track. To have an efficient use of Arcane Barrage, you pretty much just use a WeakAura. You use a WeakAura to calculate all of those buffs at once, to pretty much just tell you when to click Arcane Barrage. So their point is clear. We don't want gameplay to rely on add-ons to show the information that players need. They plan to design the game so that all the information required to use abilities is available in the interface they are designing right now in their cooldown manager. They make the example of Roll the Bones for Rogue, another one of those buttons that use, for example, WeakAuras to know when was the best time to use the ability that is being removed in the way it worked right now in the War Within compared to Midnight, or outright removed, mechanics like Blood Talons for a Feral Druid. Another part they're not happy with is abilities without meaningful gameplay. Gameplay should have some element of interest or intention. If individual abilities are frequently macroed or consistently used alongside one another, they're not really adding meaningful gameplay. You're just pressing 2 global cooldowns instead of 1 every time. Removing some of these abilities will simplify long sequences of abilities that are usually cast in the same order, for example during openers or during cooldown windows. They make the example of Assassination, a spec that uses several abilities in a row in order to maximize their cooldowns. You know, when a rogue opens up on an enemy, you always want Garrote on the enemy, you always want Rapture on the enemy. If there is more than a couple, you also always want Crimson Tempest as a dot on the enemies every time. There is no choice, there is no strategy involved. The challenge is mostly a dexterity and memory check to just keep track of all of the things you have to put on your enemies. Debuffs, dots, or buffs on yourself. As it says, several of those effects have been removed to make these windows less involved. Restoration Druid's Efflorescence is an example of a simple maintenance buff, so now they are getting this talent to allow you to get Efflorescence cooked into your life bloom. So you save a button, you save clicking Efflorescence and simply getting it for free inside of your life bloom, while also removing the option to have 2 life blooms at once. So as a Resto Druid, you went from clicking life bloom, Efflorescence to now clicking 1 life bloom. That also gives you a free Efflorescence. So you saved 2 buttons now in Midnight. The other example, which is by far the biggest problem compared to the other 2, is the many modifier auras. Right, Resto Shaman has Chain Heal. Chain Heal is good, Chain Heal is powerful. However, you can have Deluge if the target is affected by Healing Rain or Riptide to buff Chain Heal by 15%. With Tidal Waves, so using Riptide before Chain Heal, you can make Chain Heal cast 20% faster. You can use Flow of the Tides to aim your Chain Heal at a target with Riptide to make your Chain Heal 30% stronger. You can track in your WeakAuras Tidebringer to know when you have a stack of Tidebringer active to make Chain Heal 50% faster. You can also track your mana expenditure to track when High Tide is proccing to make your Chain Heal significantly stronger. You can also prior to your Chain Heal, but after your Riptide, otherwise you're going to empower Riptide, you want to use Unleash Life. So your next Chain Heal will also be stronger. Also, you can play Totemic and make sure you put down your totem so that the Chain Heal empowered by all of these buffs is also now 25% stronger because it comes from your Lively Totem effect. And lastly, why not? You can also Chain Heal the target of your Earth Shield because the target of your Earth Shield takes 20% more healing. When you take all of this combined, you're practically healing more from all of these effects increases because they are well above 100% more value of your Chain Heal than the Chain Heal itself. With these buffs, you have roughly like a 270% power of your Chain Heal. 100% come from the Chain Heal button, 170% comes from all of the buffs you have on top of that Chain Heal. But Blizzard is saying some of these abilities have interactions with other talents or implications that aren't immediately clear, but are critical to the basic performance of the ability. If you compare a Shaman that makes use of all of these Chain Heal buffs and a Shaman who simply spams Chain Heal and nothing else, the first Shaman will just triple the healing of the second Shaman. These kind of subtleties can be interesting and welcome when you are trying to master all of the fine hidden details or fine combos of a spec, but it shouldn't require a specialized knowledge to play the spec or even a specialized series of WeakAuras to keep track of 1, 2, 3 different buffs stacking power increases or debuffs on enemies, etc, etc. This one is the perfect example we had at the start with Arcane. As we said, Arcane wasn't actually losing many of their buttons, but they were losing many of these stacking damage increase interactions, particularly aimed at their Arcane Barrage, but also at their Arcane Blast and Arcane Missiles. So the buttons are still there, they're just not nearly as complicated to keep track of their damage increases compared to what they are now in the War Within. They then add the list of all of these things they are currently reviewing for purging. So gameplay with high actions per minute, high APM that can be physically demanding or uncomfortable. So we are paging outlaw rogues everywhere. This is aimed directly at you. Specs with a litany of ability buttons that make it hard to set keybinds. This is perfectly aimed at Resto Shaman, who is losing like 9 different buttons right now. Situations where lots of ability modifying procs can be active at once, causing an array of buttons on your action bars to be highlighted, proccing all over the place. This is also pretty useful for Arcane, but also for things like Enhancement Shaman or Elemental Shaman. Initially, these were supposed to be this single glow button. You proc something, that thing glows up. It means you have to press it. However, nowadays you have so many compounding buffs and procs and effects that you have like 4 or 5 different spells all glowing, which is a bit counterintuitive. As well as specs that get sometimes flooded with so many resources that managing them becomes overwhelming or feels unimportant. Back when, energy or rage or maelstrom used to be a valued resource that you had to think about how to spend, and then especially as you go deeper into an expansion, more stats, more haste, stronger tier sets, you start getting overflooded with these resources. You start to overcap with these resources more and more to make it feel like they are not even resources at all. Complex abilities or annoying simply abilities to keep track of, like Adaptive Swarm, which is going away, Surge of Power, or Blackout Combo for monks, also going away. It's interesting how also they view mastering World of Warcraft. According to them, they have spoken with tons of super high quality players. These are players that carefully review logs, simulations, video guides, they memorize complex action priorities and train their attention to perform rotations perfectly, etc, etc. And Blizzard says, okay, in Midnight, becoming an expert in WoW will look a little different because rotations will be learned more quickly. You will spend less time on remembering, realizing what you have to do with your buttons, and on how to customize addons. Well, yes, because addons are dead. And instead, you will experience new types of challenges during encounters. Now, this is the big question mark we mentioned with the death of addons as well. We still don't know exactly what these type of challenges are. We still don't know what Blizzard means, if they even are aware of what will make it challenging for players now that complex WeakAuras requiring mechanics are supposedly going to go away, how they will keep the encounters difficult. At this point, it is essentially just a leap of faith in believing Blizzard's plan that they will be able to make the encounters and even Mythic Plus keys, for example, still challenging. Now, this is the manifesto of Blizzard, what they are planning to do with their philosophy. However, then you have what is gonna look like in life, because of course, when players look at, for example, a Devastation Evoker and their buttons in a raid encounter or in Mythic Plus, for example, in the raid here, you would lose Engulf, you would lose a Shattering Star. In Mythic Plus, it would look even worse because you are losing not just Engulf and Shattering Star, you're also losing Firestorm as a button. So like over 20% of your clicks would be lost. You would be legit left with something like 4 buttons to press. So obviously there is a nice middle ground between feeling like you are over bloated with buttons as well as bloated with proc effects and damage scaling buffs that you have to keep track of, and then just having 4 buttons with very few other things to keep track of. Obviously, the big conspiracy is that this is for consoles. The plan is for Blizzard, after of course also being acquired by Microsoft and having on the horizon the possibility of going on the Game Pass, the tinfoil hat theory that this is all a plan to move to console. You are streamlining the game so that the base version of the game does not have add-ons, which would make it obviously much harder for console players to keep up with non-console players with all of their extra add-ons. So you just remove add-ons, so everyone is in the same playing field when it comes to being in combat. Then you simplify the specs to require much fewer buttons in your rotation, 4 or 5 buttons in your rotation, and you simplify the combat mechanics as well to not require as many, complex actions requiring WeakAuras, which is why they have been removed. That seemed to have been the current biggest train of thought from the player base as soon as they saw these sweeping changes to specs. Why is everything getting simplified? What would be the purpose on Blizzard's perspective to get the game to be much simpler? Especially when it feels like it is, as we said before, in such a rush. There is no testing period, there is no last season of the previous expansion for a few months to test this. This will be all pushed live at the same time at the release of the next expansion, which seems very risky. The majority of players, of course, are sad about losing many of the interactions, many of the, skill ceiling increasing kind of interactions, the way to express yourself as a good player, playing your class, your spec, mastering your character. With all of these things going away, it just makes it harder. It makes it less of a difference between a mediocre player and a very good player, because the very good player now doesn't have nearly the same amount of tools to work with because they have been removed. And as I said, this still hinges all on the promise of Blizzard. They made the promise that the add-ons are dying because we are now designing combat mechanics to still be challenging just as much as when you had WeakAuras, even now that you will be without. The promise that we will be able to make encounters, boss mechanics, trash mobs to still be challenging. And then you have the second promise about the specs being pruned, many of the complexity being taken away, because now in Midnight the way you approach challenges is going to be different, because you will learn your spec faster, but you will now have to approach challenges during encounters in a different way than before, and that presumably will take more time. If they plan on the result being the same, but now you are spending much less time mastering your spec, it means you will have to spend more time mastering something else. But that, however, as we said, is still a promise, something we don't know about. We have no idea about what they mean, how will this be implemented, how will this work out. For now, of course, because we are only seeing the negative, we are only seeing the fact that our add-ons don't work anymore, and we're only seeing the fact that our specs are losing half their buttons and half their procs and interactions with their spells. Obviously, it looks awful. It looks terrible. It just looks like a very pruned version of what we currently have. So at this point, I am very curious to see what exactly will they cook with the design of encounters, the design of mobs, enemies, bosses, and simply mechanics that you have to interact with in the next expansion. That they are so confident in this pruning of add-ons plus pruning of specs and abilities and buttons, that their design of combat, both dungeon and raid combat, will make up for it. So I'm curious to see at this point how that will end up looking like. As we have possibly predicted, there is still a very high chance this will turn into a disaster. As we said, it could either become that they massively overshot how they thought they were going to make it more challenging in the next expansion, and it will turn out to be much easier than they thought, much more simple, meaning players will absolutely steamroll through the raids, make them a one-day race to world first kind of raid because of how simple it is. Mythic Plus keys will go completely out of control. You will have to scale all the way up to a Mythic Plus 37 to start getting one-shot by mechanics because of how much simpler everything is, or maybe the opposite. maybe they completely fail, they don't actually remove any of the one-shot mechanics, the random bolt casts, the very difficult and complicated raid mechanics, which would still need a WeakAura to work, except now you don't have WeakAuras, so the bosses become drastically harder. Those two can still be options, and that is why I'm curious to see how the dungeon and boss mechanics will end up looking like in the next expansion after all of this pruning. But for today though, this is what we have in terms of the manifesto, the declaration of intent from Blizzard on what they plan to do in the next expansion. For today though, on this Friday at the beginning of our weekend, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free, as well as liking and commenting down below. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, at this point I stopped worrying about whether or not this is a good idea from Blizzard, and I just want to see the result. I just want to see the aftermath of what they can come up with.